The boss is a legend of violence, accustomed to absolute fear. He strides into the late-night diner, turning a minor service error into a public execution. He unleashes a torrential rage, daring the server to resist. His terrifying crew stands ready, waiting for the inevitable escalation. But the woman doesn't flinch. Instead, she delivers one cold, precise sentence. It is not a plea or a threat, but a secret so intimate it shatters him instantly. The city's most feared tyrant freezes, paralyzed by a past he thought was buried forever. The entire operation goes absolutely silent. The power has shifted. The fluorescent light of the Midnight Spire diner, a merciless wash of sickly yellow and harsh white, did little to flatter the remaining few late-night patrons or the cracked vinyl of the booth seats. It was October 2023, and the air hung heavy with the permanent scent of fryer oil and coffee grounds, a testament to its 24-hour grind on a major city artery. The front door, which usually groaned on its hinges, slammed silently shut as a wave of palpable menace swept across the counter. Elias Thorne, 47, entered first. He was heavy-set, commanding the space with a powerful, coiled build that radiated potential violence. His expensive Italian suit, usually a mark of refined power, seemed an afterthought to the cruel, permanent scowl etched onto his face. He walked not so much as a customer, but as a sovereign entering a domain he already owned. Behind him trailed three men, shadows forged into concrete. The most prominent was Dexter Dax Jenkins, 39, a towering figure in dark tactical clothing. A jagged pink scar pulled at the corner of his mouth, giving him a perpetually calculating expression. Dax's eyes, hyper-vigilant and cold, swept the room, cataloguing the two remaining truck drivers. The elderly counterman slumped over a crossword puzzle, and the lone waitress behind the counter. The silence that followed Thorne's entrance was profound, swallowing the tinny noise of the radio and the sizzle from the distant flat top. This was not the silence of respect, but the instantaneous, instinctual freeze caused by a predator entering the enclosed space. The waitress, Audrey Rourke, 32, did not flinch. Average build, her uniform was pressed and meticulous despite the hour. Her eyes, perpetually tired from the double shifts she needed to sustain her meager life, were nonetheless intensely perceptive, tracking every movement. She had known this moment was inevitable, perhaps not tonight, but the convergence of her life and his dark orbit was always approaching. She was emotionally reserved, possessing a lethal self-control forged through years of necessary anonymity. Thorne didn't sit in a booth. He chose the counter, forcing Audrey to serve him immediately and at close range, eliminating the comfortable distance of the tables. The three crew members took up positions, flanking him, turning the small diner into a fortress. "Coffee," Thorne rasped, his voice a low rumble that nonetheless carried absolute authority. Audrey moved efficiently. She poured a black mug from the fresh pot, setting it down with precision. The moment she did, Thorne didn't lift the mug. He merely stared at the condensation forming on the ceramic. The scrutiny was not aimed at the drink, but at the server. "This is cold," Thorne stated, the temperature of the coffee instantly becoming a seismic event in the quiet diner. Audrey's internal clock ticked, confirming the pot had been brewed less than 5 minutes ago. "Sir, that pot was just made. I can get you a fresh cup if you'd like." Her tone was level, neither defensive nor apologetic, the precise neutrality required to survive minimum-wage servitude. This controlled response was precisely the tinder Thorne needed. He was a man pathologically dominant, accustomed to fear, and viewed any lack of immediate, subservient apology as an act of insolence. The minor service infraction, the cold coffee mug, was merely the excuse. "Fresh cup," Thorne spat, leaning forward slightly, his eyes narrowing to slits. "Do you think I'm complaining about the freshness? I'm complaining about the service." His voice rose slightly, and one of the truck drivers quickly gathered his check and slipped out the door, abandoning his meal. Dax shifted, his weight transferring onto the balls of his feet, ready for the violence he assumed was imminent. "I asked for coffee." "Not lukewarm swill poured by a girl who looks like she spent the last 3 days staring at a wall," Thorne continued, now fully unleashing the torrent of public abuse designed to shatter her composure. "You move slow, you talk back. Do you know who I am?" Audrey met his gaze. The challenge was direct, primal. Thorne needed her to break, to cry, to apologize profusely so he could bask in the reaffirmation of his power. "I know where I work, Mr. Thorne," Audrey replied. Her hands, resting lightly on the counter, were steady. She knew her escape hinged entirely on the immediate explosive impact of her revelation. If she failed to land the blow cleanly, the consequences would be lethal. Her composure, often mistaken for indifference, was instead a cage around a fiercely protective core. Thorne chuckled, a dry, cruel sound. "Oh, she knows my name. Good. Then you know that when I ask for something, I don't get excuses. I get solutions. When I pay money, I expect competence, and what I'm looking at right now is a complete waste of polyester and bad coffee." The venom in his voice was thick. He picked up the ceramic mug, his heavy fingers dwarfing the handle, and slowly brought it up, not to drink, but to emphasize the weight of his displeasure. He was testing the boundaries, measuring how far he could push before she crumpled. He wanted the fear in her eyes to reflect his own cruel satisfaction. "You think this is funny, girl? You think serving food is a joke?" he roared, his voice now booming, vibrating the cheap laminated counter surface. "I could buy this whole miserable strip mall and have them pave over this place before sunrise. You'd be looking for a new place to screw up tomorrow, wouldn't you? You'd be on the street begging for tips, crying into your miserable little apron." Dax watched Audrey closely. Most people, even hardened men, usually folded after the first wave of Thorne's rage, but the waitress just stared back, her tired eyes unwavering, almost calculating. Dax felt a prickle of unease. Her self-control was unnatural for someone in her position. Thorne slammed the mug back down, the noise echoing like a gunshot. "Apologize right now. Grovel. Tell me how useless you are and how lucky you are that I haven't decided to teach you a lesson." Audrey took a slow, deep breath, pulling the scent of stale grease into her lungs. The air was thick, pressurized by Thorne's fury. This was the moment, the exact narrow window of opportunity. She had risked everything, her anonymity, her safety, her life, on this single exchange. She had meticulously constructed her defense, not based on pleas or threats, but on cold, surgically precise knowledge. She focused entirely on Thorne, cutting out the noise of his crew, the harsh lighting, and the beating of her own heart. She saw not the crime boss, but the frightened boy hidden beneath the layers of tailored arrogance and blood money. She saw the vulnerability that the faded ledger page had revealed. Her voice, when it came, was quiet, cutting through the residual echo of Thorne's shout like a laser beam. It was not the voice of a scared waitress, but the tone of a judge delivering a damning, undeniable verdict. "The coffee isn't cold, Mr. Thorne," Audrey Rourke said, her gaze locked on his. "It's exactly the temperature your father preferred it before he went missing from the Providence Heights warehouse in '98. The effect was absolute. The air pressure in the diner seemed to drop instantly. Elias Thorne froze. His enormous, powerful hand, still resting near the cold coffee mug, clenched, but the movement immediately aborted, leaving him paralyzed mid-action. His cruel scowl didn't just fade, it shattered, replaced by an expression of stark, paralyzing terror. The color drained from his face, leaving the deep, scarring shadows of his permanent frown standing out like bruises. The specific detail, the Providence Heights warehouse in '98, was the needle piercing the heart of his carefully buried past. The warehouse, an abandoned industrial storage facility, was not public knowledge. It was the structural echo chamber where his predecessor, his own father, vanished. An event Thorne himself had orchestrated and covered up with lethal efficiency decades ago. The faded ledger page, which she had seen only in fragments, contained the precise location and date of the disposal, information only 2 other people in the world possessed, and one of them was dead. Thorne's tyranny was rooted in the unquestioned belief that he controlled the narrative of his own life, that his dark origins were eternally sealed. Audrey's single sentence had publicly ripped that seal away. His crew, hardened veterans accustomed to every variety of violence, were completely silenced. Dax, the hypervigilant second, watched his boss's face implode, and the sight was more terrifying than any firefight he had ever endured. Thorne, their unwavering tyrannical force, the man who instilled loyalty via overwhelming fear, was reduced in an instant to an exposed, hunted animal. The silence that followed Audrey's revelation stretched, filled only by the low hum of the refrigerator unit and the rapid, shallow gasps of Elias Thorne struggling for air. Dax's mind raced, a complex calculation running at lethal speed. He looked at Audrey, then back at Thorne. Who was she? Why was she a waitress? How did she know? The knowledge was the key. If she knew that, What else did she know? The shift in power was undeniable, volatile and immediate. The fear that had always flowed from Thorne to his men suddenly redirected, hitting the boss full force, and the crew felt the backwash. Thorne finally managed a sound, a strangled, guttural noise that was nowhere near his usual booming roar. "How?" he whispered, the single syllable costing him monumental effort. Audrey did not move, did not break eye contact. She let the silence hold the weight of her knowledge, ensuring the entire crew understood the catastrophic nature of the vulnerability she had exposed. "That's not relevant, Mr. Thorne," Audrey replied, her voice remaining quiet and utterly calm. "What is relevant is that I am standing here unharmed, and I am aware that you prefer your coffee hot, despite your attempts to emulate your missing predecessor." She had confirmed the knowledge, sealed the threat. It was an elegant, cold dissection of his deepest insecurity, his desperate, pathological need to prove he was a better, tougher version of the man he had betrayed. Thorne tried to stand, but his legs seemed to forget their function. He gripped the edge of the counter, his knuckles white. He knew he could not simply kill her. Not here. Not now. If the knowledge was communicable, if she had leverage, a dead man's switch, her immediate death would only trigger the public collapse of his entire empire. Audrey saw the raw calculation in his eyes. The moment the murderous impulse hit the wall of self-preservation, she knew her protection was only temporary, valid only as long as her silence was worth more to him than her elimination. She reached beneath the counter. Her movements were slow, deliberate, signaling no hidden weapons, only necessary actions. She pulled out the encrypted burner phone, a cheap black plastic device, and placed it on the counter, sliding it toward him. "This is not a negotiation," Audrey stated. "This is information management. I leave now. You will allow me to leave. You will not follow me, and you will not send anyone to find me. The moment I confirm my safety, the details surrounding the Providence Heights incident remain where they are." Thorne stared at the phone. It was the physical manifestation of her control. "Who are you?" Thorne demanded again, his voice cracking, the powerful facade finally crumbling. "Someone who used to clean the office of a very careful bookkeeper," Audrey answered, a cryptic reference to the origin of the faded ledger page, which detailed the logistics of the '98 operation. "Someone who remembered certain dates, certain locations, someone who learned to be meticulous, Mr. Thorne, just like you." She had used the phone not to call an escape driver, but to send a single pre-drafted message to an anonymous dead-drop email address she had established weeks ago. The message contained a single word: deploy. It was the signal that the information was now public and timed for release if her status changed to unsafe. Her life was the timer. Audrey didn't wait for a reply. She reached behind the counter, stripped off her apron and placed it neatly beside the discarded cold coffee mug. Dax watched, mesmerized by the sheer, cold audacity. He was supposed to move, to neutralize the threat, but the explicit, visible paralysis of his boss had created a vacuum of authority. To move against the Waitress now, without Thorne's direct command, might mean moving against the interests of their organization, an organization now visibly threatened by the very foundation of its existence. As Audrey walked around the counter, her uniform shift giving her unexpected civilian anonymity, she paused, glancing back at Thorne. He was still frozen, his pathologically dominant demeanor utterly annihilated. "Have a good night, Mr. Thorne," she said. She walked toward the front door, passing within inches of Dax, whose hand instinctively twitched near his concealed weapon. He held the movement. He watched her open the door and step out into the chill October air. Thorne finally slammed his fist onto the counter, the sound forcing a gasp from his crew. "Dax," Thorne growled, his voice raw with fury and terror. "The phone. Get the phone. Now." Dax moved instantly, grabbing the encrypted burner phone. "Trace it. Find out who she sent that signal to. Find out where she went," Thorne commanded, rising unsteadily. He was breathing heavily, his chest heaving under the expensive suit. "And Dax, when you find her, you don't touch her. Not yet. We need to know what she released. We need to know if the page is out." Thorne pushed past his remaining men and stumbled toward the men's room, not out of necessity, but to escape the suffocating public humiliation. The tyrant had been exposed, his fear laid bare in a greasy diner under the glare of harsh fluorescent lights. Dax held the encrypted burner phone, his calculating eyes focused on the empty space where Audrey Rourke had stood. He knew this was the end of the old regime, regardless of how Thorne tried to recover. The power had shifted, not to him, but to the anonymous waitress who had possessed the one thing more lethal than Thorne's army, the precise truth. Dax took a breath, the stench of stale coffee suddenly tasting metallic and sharp. He looked at the counter, at the abandoned mug, and understood the new reality. Elias Thorne was wounded, perhaps fatally, by a single quiet sentence. Dax initiated the trace, knowing that his loyalty was now fully directed towards self-preservation and the inevitable cleanup of a collapsing empire, a cleanup that might very well include Thorne himself. The faded ledger page, though unseen by them, was now the most powerful weapon in the city, wielded by a woman who merely wanted to survive her shift. The Midnight Spire diner was silent once more, but the silence now held the heavy promise of lethal consequence, confirming that the most feared man in the city had just been publicly dismantled by the most anonymous person in the room. Audrey Rourke was gone, swallowed by the night, leaving behind a crater in the center of the city's underworld. The swinging door of the men's room clattered shut, trapping Elias in a cramped, stale-smelling space, far removed from the tailored luxury he usually inhabited. He leaned against the cold tile wall, his expensive silk tie suddenly feeling like a noose. The mirror reflected a man stripped bare. The permanent scowl had melted away, revealing the raw, panicked vulnerability beneath. Elias had built his entire identity, his dominion, on the murder of his father and the flawless erasure of that historical stain. That single, quiet sentence from Audrey, the waitress, had detonated the foundation of his world. The Providence Heights warehouse in '98. The phrase echoed, a perfect crystalline articulation of his greatest sin and deepest fear. How? It was impossible. He had personally supervised the cleanup. Only 2 others knew the full details, and they were buried deeper than the concrete foundation of that derelict storage unit. Elias gripped the porcelain sink, forcing himself to breathe, but his lungs felt constricted by a crushing, invisible weight, humiliation mixed with lethal terror. His men had witnessed it, his absolute collapse. They saw the hammer turn to dust. That moment in the diner, under the hideous fluorescent light, was not just a threat to his life but a public execution of his authority. He had to reclaim control instantly, brutally, before the virus of doubt and insubordination spread. Outside, Dax stood rigid beside the counter, the cheap plastic of the encrypted burner phone warm in his massive hand. His mind worked with frightening clarity, filtering the static of the present crisis. Elias' public display of abject terror was the defining moment of their organization. Fear was their currency, and now the boss himself was insolvent. The other 2 crew members, burly men named Vic and Manny, exchanged glances that spoke volumes. Confusion, shock, and a dawning realization that the rules had changed. "We move," Dax commanded, his voice low and guttural, asserting immediate operational control in Elias' absence. "Vic, sanitize the counter. Get that mug. Manny, check the parking lot. Find out which direction she walked." Dax focused on the phone. The device was basic, clearly designed for disposable use. He immediately checked the sent folder, the single word, deploy. The timestamp was less than a minute old. The message had been routed through a complex series of relay servers and finally delivered to a ghost address. Audrey hadn't relied on a simple cellular signal. She had planned this with the precision of a military operation. "Vic, the mug," Dax snapped, holding out a plastic baggie from his pocket. The cold coffee mug, the insignificant catalyst, was now evidence. Fingerprints on that counter. We need to know who she is, where she came from. She wasn't just a waitress. Dax knew they were too late. Deploy meant the information was out of her hands. Her safety was no longer the primary issue. Managing the fallout was. He needed to find the recipient of that message. If Audrey was truly meticulous, the information wasn't sent to one person, but likely to a timed release system, perhaps an offshore server programmed to release the faded ledger page publicly if she missed a check-in. Elias burst from the restroom, his face sallow and mottled with residual fear and pure, unfettered rage. He ignored his crew's efforts, striding directly to Dax. "Well, what did you find?" Elias demanded, clutching Dax's shoulder with a grip that threatened to crack bone. "The message was sent," Dax reported, his voice flat, professional. "Single word, deploy. Trace is running, but the routing is complex. It's not local. The page. Is it out? We can't know yet. But if she's who she says she is, a meticulous planner. It's timed. She's bought herself a window of protection. We move too fast, we trigger the release. We wait too long, it goes public anyway. Elias staggered back, running a trembling hand over his perfectly slicked hair. A bookkeeper. She mentioned a bookkeeper. Find the files, find the ledger. The faded ledger page was a ghost document, a myth whispered among the most senior of the old regime, detailing the logistics of the '98 cleanup, payments made, location of the disposal, the exact timetable. If that document surfaced, it wouldn't just implicate Elias in patricide, it would validate the rumors that he had inherited the organization through bloody usurpation, destroying the carefully constructed facade of a smooth, legitimate transition of power. "We need to go," Elias, Dax urged. "Now. The longer we stay here, the more exposed we are. We'll regroup at the warehouse and hit the contacts." Elias nodded, but his movement was jerky, uncoordinated. He was still the predator, but he was wounded and bleeding authority. Audrey, meanwhile, was 3 blocks away, swallowed by the early morning shadows. She moved with the brisk, anonymous pace of someone walking off a grueling shift, not someone fleeing the wrath of the city's most dangerous man. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic rhythm that contradicted the calmness of her exterior. The self-control she displayed was less a character trait and more a critical operational necessity. She turned into a narrow, unlit alley, ducking behind a row of overflowing industrial bins. She pulled off the drab polyester uniform shirt, revealing a dark thermal layer beneath. The uniform was the costume. The thermal layer was her first step back into anonymity. She hadn't run far deliberately. She needed to seem like a target of opportunity, not a seasoned operative. But the next stage of her plan required complete isolation. Audrey wasn't heading for an airport or a train station. She was heading to a location chosen months ago, an abandoned sub-level of an old municipal building, a place only city planners and rats knew existed. She had 2 objectives: confirm the deploy message had been received and establish a continuous, anonymous video feed back to the server holding the faded ledger page. If her feed stopped, the release mechanism would activate, guaranteeing the truth of Elias' origin story would flood the internet. She reached her temporary sanctuary, a damp, cold concrete chamber smelling of mildew and stagnant water. She set up her sparse equipment, a small laptop, an independent power source, and a compact directional satellite dish pointed carefully through a ventilation shaft. Accessing the anonymous dead drop confirmed success. Deploy received. The clock was ticking. She had 72 hours before the automated release, 72 hours to achieve her true goal, which was not to destroy Elias, but to guarantee her own continued existence, free from his orbit. Audrey wasn't motivated by justice or revenge. She was motivated by a meticulous instinct for self-preservation. She had found the faded ledger page months ago while cleaning the deceased bookkeeper's office after the man had supposedly retired. She realized instantly the lethal currency she possessed. She hadn't sought conflict. The conflict had sought her the moment she wore the diner uniform, and Elias decided to assert his dominance. She opened the laptop and began encrypting her location. She needed to prepare the second layer of her defense, a curated leak of Elias' recent, less explosive activities, designed to distract and disorient his immediate search party. Back at the Providence Heights warehouse, the very symbol of Elias's secret sin, the atmosphere was poisonous. The warehouse, an immense echoing chamber of concrete and cold steel, amplified the strained silence of the crew. This was where the ghosts lived, and tonight they felt closer than ever. Elias paced the floor, kicking at the dust motes dancing in the sickly yellow security lights. He had demanded absolute silence while Dax worked. Dax had laid out a temporary command center on a stack of dilapidated wooden pallets. He bypassed the burner phone's basic security and delved into the message routing. The complexity confirmed his initial assessment. Amateur hour, this was not. Elias stopped pacing. How do you know that? If she was selling it, she'd be negotiating, not deploying. The message is a defense mechanism. She created a doomsday switch. The page is scheduled for public release if she fails to check in. Elias' eyes, usually calculating, were now wide with feral desperation. Find the check-in time. Find the frequency. Dax shook his head. I can't. That connection is encrypted beyond our resources here. We need the location of her base of operations. We need to find Audrey. She's a waitress. How could she organize this? Who is she working for? Elias roared, frustration boiling over into paranoia. She works for herself, Elias. Her control, her meticulous nature. It wasn't about the coffee mug. It was about proving to you that she knows the most dangerous secret in your life. And she chose that moment to ensure maximum psychological impact and witnesses. The climax of the situation was the realization of the absolute power shift. Elias, despite his wealth and army, was now subservient to the schedule of an anonymous waitress. He was no longer the hunter, but the cornered prey waiting for the timer to run out. Elias sank onto a rusty barrel, momentarily defeated. He looked around the vast, oppressive space of the warehouse, the place where he had shed his own father's blood to assume the throne. The air felt heavy with retribution. "We need a clean extraction," Elias finally managed, his voice low and dangerous. "No violence until we secure the information. Bring her here. We negotiate her silence." Dax nodded, but his mind had already moved 3 steps ahead of his boss. Negotiation was obsolete. Audrey had made it clear. Her silence was guaranteed only by her safety, and her safety was guaranteed only by the threat of public exposure. Dax's search methodology shifted. Instead of tracking the digital signal, he focused on the analog trail. The bookkeeper Audrey had mentioned. Where did he live? Where did he keep his records? Audrey had to have connections to that life. For the next 48 hours, the city's underworld was in silent, terrified motion. Elias was a ghost, unable to appear publicly for fear of exposing his weakness. The organization, usually a smooth, lethal machine, was sputtering, fueled only by Dax's desperate hunt. Dax tracked the deceased bookkeeper's final months. He discovered the man had hired an anonymous cleaning service just before his retirement, a meticulous service run by a single, untraceable individual. He found the service's operating address, a dilapidated post office box. He cross-referenced the few known physical descriptions with the image of the diner waitress. The match was unsettlingly close. Dax found Audrey's small apartment, empty, stripped clean of any identifying possessions, a temporary shell. He found the precise financial trail, small meticulous deposits always staying under the radar, but enough to sustain a life of focused research and self-training. Audrey hadn't spent her life serving coffee. She had spent it preparing for the inevitability of being noticed. Finally, Dax found the trail leading to the old municipal building. He approached alone, leaving Elias and the rest of the crew under heavy security at the warehouse. Dax knew that if he was going to execute the final necessary move, he needed to do it without Elias' paranoid interference. Dax entered the sub-level chamber quietly. The air was cold, damp. Audrey sat calmly before her laptop, the glow illuminating the perpetual tiredness in her eyes. She looked up as Dax's massive shadow fell across the concrete. She didn't flinch. "Hello, Dax," Audrey said, her voice steady. "I assumed they would send the smart one." Dax stood 10 feet away, assessing the setup. The small satellite dish, the laptop, the power source. He saw the continuous feed window open on the screen. "The timer has 24 hours remaining," Dax stated, referring to the automated release. "Elias wants you to disarm it. He wants to negotiate." "There is nothing to negotiate," Audrey countered, calmly closing the laptop lid, cutting the immediate feed. "I don't want money. I don't want power. I want to continue being Audrey Rourke, a woman who is meticulously invisible. Elias cannot guarantee that. His fear will compel him to destroy me the moment the threat is neutralized." Dax knew she was right. Elias was beyond rational compromise. His only solution would be permanent lethal silence, regardless of the consequences. "Elias is compromised," Dax admitted, the words heavy with disloyalty. "He exposed his greatest weakness to the entire city. The organization cannot survive if he remains in charge, living under your schedule." "Then fix it," Audrey challenged, her eyes unwavering. "The faded ledger page doesn't only implicate Elias, it proves he violated the old code. It proves he is unfit to rule. That information is not a weapon against you, Dax. It is the truth about the man you fear." Dax reached into his tactical vest. Audrey did not move. Her composure remained absolute. She knew her only true defense was the knowledge that her death would trigger the immediate certain end of the organization. Dax pulled out a second device, not a weapon, but a large encrypted hard drive. "You need to live, Audrey," Dax said. "The organization needs to survive, but it cannot survive under Elias' paranoia. I need to know the information is safe, permanent, and that the switch is permanently disarmed, so I can conduct the necessary cleanup. Cleanup. A smooth transition of power, Dax corrected, his scarred face expressionless. If the page goes public, we all go down. If Elias disappears, quietly, the problem remains internal, contained. The page provides the necessary leverage for the other families to accept the new leadership. Audrey finally broke her stance, leaning back against the cold wall. She studied Dax, the hyper-vigilant enforcer whose loyalty had just pivoted from fear of his boss to the calculation of survival. You want the page to validate the coup, Audrey realized. The truth is your new currency. The truth is stability, Dax corrected. Give me the final trigger codes, and I will personally ensure you are placed under the protection of the newly restructured organization. You can go back to being meticulously invisible, with the added benefit of never needing to look over your shoulder again. Audrey smiled faintly, a small tired curving of her lips. She understood the exchange. She had used Elias's past to secure her future, and Dax was now using that same past to secure his. She typed a series of complex alphanumeric strings into the laptop and opened the secure file containing the faded ledger page, a scanned image of brittle, sepia-toned paper, listing dates, dollar amounts, and the precise coordinates of the disposal site in the Providence Heights warehouse. This is the faded ledger page, Audrey stated, rotating the screen so Dax could see. The server holding the original will be destroyed electronically when this transfer is complete. The digital switch is permanently disabled. You hold the truth now, Dax. Dax connected the hard drive. The transfer was slow, deliberate. The quiet hum of the laptop and the drip of water in the cold chamber were the only sounds accompanying the death of Elias Thorne's reign. When the transfer was complete, Dax disconnected the drive, securing it inside his vest. Your safety is guaranteed, Dax confirmed. You will be escorted out of the city tonight. New identity, new location. You will never see a diner uniform again. Audrey watched him, the intense perceptiveness of her eyes seeming to pierce through his tactical gear. And Elias? Dax merely tightened his grip on the hard drive. Elias Thorne is about to discover that his father was not the only ghost residing in the Providence Heights warehouse. Audrey knew exactly what that meant. The power vacuum created by her single sentence was now being sealed by Dax's decisive action. The cleanup was swift, clinical, and permanent. She gathered her minimal belongings, leaving the sub-level chamber with Dax. She looked back one last time at the damp walls, then stepped into the cool night air. The city was still asleep, unaware that the core of its criminal power structure had been quietly, ruthlessly dismantled. Audrey Rourke walked away from the city artery and the harsh fluorescent glow of the Midnight Spire diner, not as a waitress fleeing abuse, but as a survivor who had mastered the art of information management. She had faced down a tyrant with nothing but the truth, and she had won her freedom. Her anonymity was restored, protected by the very empire she had momentarily destabilized. Elias Thorne's fear had been her shield, and now it was his tomb. The silence she had imposed upon his crew had become the permanent silence of the city's newly altered underworld. The night air, thick with the damp promise of rain, felt like a cleansing breath to Audrey. She walked beside Dax, their footsteps echoing unnaturally loud on the concrete. She wasn't running, she was marching toward a guaranteed future. The meticulous planning that had fueled her survival instinct had culminated not in flight, but in a transfer of lethal power. Dax led her to an unmarked black sedan idling 2 blocks from the sub-level chamber. Inside, a woman named Lena, a low-level operator Dax trusted implicitly, but who had no direct ties to Elias, sat behind the wheel. Lena possessed the quiet efficiency that Audrey herself prized. Lena has the instructions, Dax stated, pausing by the passenger door, a secure route, documentation, and a fund transfer that will be untraceable within 3 hours. You have guaranteed anonymity. Audrey looked at the massive man, the primary executioner of Elias's will for years, now acting as her silent protector. Elias won't believe it. He doesn't have a choice, Dax replied, his scarred face impassive in the weak streetlight. His paranoia is a predictable mechanism. He will demand proof of destruction, but I will give him only the illusion of control. The original is secured, and the copy is with me. That is all he needs to know before the final curtain. Audrey nodded, opening the car door. She didn't offer a handshake or a word of thanks. Such sentimentality was unnecessary and possibly dangerous. Their transaction was one of mutual assurance. her silence for her life, and her truth for Dax's ascendancy. October 2023, Audrey murmured, locking eyes with Dax. Remember the time? I will, Dax confirmed, a cold finality in his voice. We owe you the stability you created. Audrey slid into the back seat. Lena pulled away smoothly, merging into the sparse early morning traffic. As the cityscape receded, Audrey didn't look back at the labyrinth of streets she had navigated while wearing the guise of a tired waitress. She looked forward, focusing on the coordinates of the small coastal town 3 states away, a place where the air was always salty and the gossip never reached the halls of power. She was finally, truly, invisible. The Providence Heights warehouse was no longer a place of operational security. It was a mausoleum waiting for its resident. Elias, still dressed in the expensive, ill-fitting suit that had witnessed his public humiliation, was a twitching knot of adrenaline and anxiety. He paced the exact area where, 25 years prior, he had watched the concrete dry over his father's final resting place, a spot now marked only by a slight discoloration in the floor. Vic and Manny stood by the corrugated iron door, their posture rigid, their eyes avoiding their boss. They had seen the fear, and the fear had metastasized into insubordination. They waited not for Elias' command, but for Dax's return. Elias stopped his frantic pacing, turning on the 2 subordinates. Where is he? Elias spat, his voice hoarse from shouting demands into the abyss of the empty building. Dax! He should have called. He should have dragged her back here screaming. Vic shifted uncomfortably, avoiding eye contact. He said he was neutralizing the threat, Elias. He went in clean. Neutralizing. That meant securing the page. That meant ending the clock. If that bookkeeper's filth hits the web, we're finished. Do you understand, Vic? Finished. A heavy vehicle pulled up outside, the sound of its tires crunching on the gravel instantly silencing the warehouse. Vic and Manny snapped to attention. Dax entered, the hard drive containing the faded ledger page secure against his chest. He moved with a heavy, deliberate slowness that signaled a profound, irreversible change. He was no longer the enforcer. He was the judge. Elias lunged toward him, desperation eclipsing all sense of caution. The page. Did you get it? Did you silence her? Where is the mug? Tell me you secured the original files, Dax. Dax did not flinch, allowing Elias to close the distance until they were nose to nose, the smell of Elias' expensive cologne mixing with the stale dust of the warehouse. The threat is neutralized, Elias, Dax said, his voice a low, steady rumble, stripped of any deference. The codes? Show me the codes. Did you confirm the server termination? Dax took a calculated step back, forcing Elias to drop his aggressive stance. He held up the encrypted hard drive, turning it slowly under the sickly yellow light. Audrey had contingencies within contingencies, Dax began, laying out the narrative with forensic clarity. If she died, the page was set for an immediate public release. If she was captured, the same. Her demands were simple and absolute: freedom and anonymity, guaranteed by the continued threat of exposure. Elias stared at the drive, his face slackening. Then you killed her after you got the codes. You killed her. I secured the page, Elias, Dax corrected, emphasizing the name change. The truth is now solely in my possession. Audrey is beyond your reach, placed under protection. She will never be heard from again, provided the contents of this drive remain secure. Elias blinked, his mind struggling to comprehend the paradigm shift. Dax hadn't just secured the information, he had validated the source. He had accepted Audrey's authority over Elias. You let her go. You betrayed me for a diner waitress, Elias whispered, the shock momentarily replacing the rage. I secured the organization, Dax corrected again. Your actions in the diner, your public display of terror, signaled the end of your utility, Elias. You ruled through fear. When the fear turned inward, it exposed a fatal weakness. Dax pulled a folded, brittle sheet of paper from a hidden pouch in the hard drive casing. It was a physical photocopy of the faded ledger page, the coordinates of the disposal site circled in faded black ink. This is the price of that weakness, Dax continued, holding the paper so Elias could clearly see the logistics of the 1998 cleanup. Audrey didn't just have evidence of patricide, she had the validation of your usurpation. The other families respected the previous regime, the old code. You broke that code, and now I have the evidence to prove it. Elias stumbled backward, running into one of the massive steel support columns. His mind reeled not from the threat of death that had always been abstract, but from the crushing reality of his utter loss of control, amplified 1,000 times by the location of the confrontation. He was trapped in the physical manifestation of his greatest sin. "You think they'll follow you? You think you can take over with a piece of paper?" Elias snarled, desperately trying to reassert his dominance through sheer force of will. Dax took another step, closing the distance slowly, inexorably. Vic and Manny, witnessing the scene, instinctively moved to block the main exit, signaling their implicit alignment with Dax. "They will follow the man who ensures stability, Elias," Dax stated simply. "The page gives me the leverage I need. You, on the other hand, are a liability. Your continued existence means we are constantly subject to Audrey's protection mechanisms. That is unacceptable." The atmosphere in the warehouse compressed, thick and lethal. Elias understood, finally, the precise, chilling calculus of Dax's loyalty. It was purely transactional, focused entirely on the survival of the structure, not the preservation of the king. Elias roared, a sound of absolute primal fury and despair, and lunged for the hard drive. He didn't seek to fight Dax. He sought to destroy the truth that had consumed him. Dax moved with the practiced, disciplined speed of a trained operative. He sidestepped the wild lunge. Elias, heavy and unbalanced, staggered past him. It was over before Elias could recover his footing. Dax did not use a gun. That would be too loud, too chaotic, and too easily traced. He used a specialized garrote wire, securing it around Elias's throat from behind. The struggle was brief and brutally silent, contained entirely within the echoing expanse of the warehouse. Elias thrashed, his expensive suit rumpling, his face turning a sickening shade of purple under the weak security lights. His last sight was the cold, unyielding face of Dax, his most trusted enforcer, watching him die with the detached professionalism of a surgeon completing a difficult procedure. Dax maintained the pressure until the movement ceased and Elias slumped to the cold concrete floor, falling precisely onto the discolored patch marking his father's grave. Vic and Manny stood frozen, their earlier anxiety replaced by a cold, immediate acceptance of the new order. The transfer of power was complete, witnessed and cemented by blood in the place of the original sin. Dax removed the wire, coiling it neatly back into his tactical vest. He looked down at Elias' body, not with regret, but with the weary relief of a man who had finally solved a complex, dangerous equation. "Vic," Dax commanded, his voice now carrying the undisputed weight of authority. "Sanitize. Manny, contact the old contacts. Use the code phrase, 'The hammer is broken.' We meet with the families at dawn. This transition must be clean, precise, and permanent." "Understood, Dax," Vic responded instantly, his tone respectful, professional. The fear was still there, but it was a directed fear, the fear of a competent subordinate serving a ruthlessly effective leader. Far away, Audrey Rourke sat in the back of the sedan, watching the Atlantic coastline flicker past the window. She felt the sudden, internal snap of tension releasing, the subconscious knowledge that the threat had been completely, fatally removed. It was a physical sensation, like a muscle finally relaxing after months of debilitating cramp. Lena pulled into a small, isolated private airstrip carved into the pine forests bordering the ocean. A small twin-engine prop plane waited on the tarmac, its engines already running, preparing for a long eastward flight over international waters. The new documentation Lena handed Audrey was flawless. A clean name, a comprehensive history that held up to immediate scrutiny, and a bank account that ensured financial independence. Everything was geared toward her core desire, to be meticulously invisible. "The location is secure, Audrey," Lena confirmed, her voice low. "Off-grid, but with a redundant communications link only accessible by Dax. If the truth ever needs to surface again, you can activate the emergency beacon. But he has guaranteed the page will be used to maintain stability, not chaos." Audrey took the documents, tucking them into a specialized heat-sealed pouch. She looked out at the churning grey ocean, the opposite of the stale, grease-filled air of the Midnight Spire diner. "The power of a single sentence," Audrey observed, almost to herself. "It's not about volume, is it? It's about devastating relevance." Lena offered a small, knowing smile. It paralyzed him, and when the hammer stopped swinging, the structure collapsed. Audrey stepped out onto the tarmac. The wind whipped her hair, carrying the tang of salt and freedom. She was no longer defined by the polyester uniform or the exhausted look in her eyes. She was defined by the lethal self-control that had allowed her to leverage the city's greatest criminal secret at the moment of highest visibility. She boarded the small plane, strapping herself into the worn leather seat. As the plane taxied down the runway, Audrey opened her laptop, the replacement she had secured immediately after leaving the sub-level chamber. She confirmed the final status of the secondary communication device taped into the collar of her discarded uniform. It was now dormant, its last tracked position being a municipal dump site, hours away from her actual location. The analog trail was cold. She looked at a satellite map of the city she was leaving behind, specifically locating the industrial stretch containing the Providence Heights warehouse. She imagined the cold silence there, the precise cleanup executed by Dax, the finality of Elias' defeat. The plane gained speed, lifting off the ground and banking sharply toward the sea. The city lights became a distant, glittering smear, a place she had known, conquered, and survived. Audrey closed her eyes, letting the vibration of the aircraft soothe her. Her meticulously chosen sentence, the Providence Heights warehouse in '98, had accomplished its dual purpose. It had secured her life, and it had fundamentally altered the criminal landscape of the city, not through a gang war or a spectacular betrayal, but through the quiet, paralyzing application of inescapable truth. She was gone, a ghost in the system, her anonymity guaranteed by the very machinery of power she had momentarily terrified. She had won her freedom, trading a single devastating piece of knowledge for permanent, untroubled silence. The waitress was gone. Only the meticulously invisible survivor remained. The city would soon adjust to Dax's pragmatic rule, and Elias Thorne would become just another whispered rumor of a boss who vanished, consumed by the ghosts he thought he had buried deep beneath the concrete of the Providence Heights warehouse. If you dug it, thumbs up and subscribe.